What's your first memory of the name Rustic Kitchen or the idea of Rustic Kitchen?
Um, a little backstory here. Faneuil Hall was operated by the Rouse Company. Jim Rouse was a trailblazing developer who had come up with this urban um, mercantile retail dining center. And he convinced the city of Boston to revamp Faneuil Hall. Faneuil Hall had been built in the early 1800s, and the center building that Copper Dome is on, which is called the Quincy Market, was there, and it was actually built by the mayor, Joshua Quincy, and it was very successful at the time, and it was, they say, and it might even be true today, the largest open air food market in the country.
Mhm.
And it served the city for many years, and he was hailed for that. And he didn't use any city money for it, and he didn't have to raise taxes. And that became sort of the epicenter. And at the time, the waterfront came all the way up to just the beginning of Faneuil Hall. Again, this is probably 1826, 27, 28. So the harbor was right there. And it was a center mercantile hub of the city for a couple 150 years. But by the early 1970s, it had lived its life. It was broken down, decrepit. It was like a warehouse. It was overrun with rats, and it was just a terrible place. It wasn't safe to go down there. And Jim Rouse came along and he convinced the city to allow him to turn this into this idea, this urban shopping and dining place that he had developed. So they did a deal with him, and he actually signed a 99-year lease because they wouldn't sell him the property.
So the city of Boston owns this, but then this third-party operator, private developer runs it and leases
Right,
it out to tenants. Okay.
right. So he does that and launches it in 1976 to a lot of fanfare, and it's a smashing success. And Faneuil Hall sort of redefined urban shopping, urban dining. It became the number one tourist attraction in the city of Boston for many, many years. And even to this very day, I think there's probably 30 million people that go through Faneuil Hall annually. I think the only other place that competes with it is probably up at the Prudential area, which is now a massive uh, dining and retail area that is like connected to Copley. But up to that point, Faneuil Hall was the number one destination. And within about 20 years, it sort of needed a facelift. They'd figured out what worked and what didn't. Um, Along the way, I'm not quite sure when, I think it was in the early 1900s, two more buildings were built. You had the center Quincy Market building, and then you had what became the North Market and the South Market. And that's why you have those three long buildings with those public walkways between them. And those were built with mercantile shops on the first floor and an office space on the second and third floor of both of them. So by the early to mid 90s, this thing needs a shot in the arm. They've had some tenant turnover. They've figured out some things. They have the whole street performer that sort of comes into play, and they have to figure that out. And they also have the Faneuil Hall building, which is a very historic building. It's still used for a lot of meetings, a lot of political events that still happen there. Any major candidate that wants to, Ted Kennedy, when he announced his running, he announced it from Faneuil Hall. So I had to
Mhm.
figure all these things out. Parking was an issue for a while. They had to build more structured parking around it. And I had a relationship with the Rouse Company. I built a restaurant that became very successful in the South Market building. They knew me, they liked me, and they had this plan to sort of enclose more of the Quincy Market building with these glass boxes. So
Mhm.
the building is a historic landmark, and you can't change the building, you can't change the granite, you can't change anything. So what they did was they added these glass structures that ran along both sides of the building to make them more of a three-season, almost a four-season type event. And they captured all of that outdoor area. And in all four corners, they wanted to have some sort of food and beverage operator. And they were just building them at the time. They wanted me to walk through it. I met with their contractor, and he told me things like we're going to put radiant heat in the slab so you can leave the doors open, and on February days you'll still be warm sitting inside. And they had a lot of it right. What they didn't have was they didn't set it up for a restaurant. They didn't have exhaust ducts coming in. They didn't have makeup air coming in. They didn't break out the electric services, which
They
were
didn't have bathrooms. Did they? Didn't we have to use shared bathrooms
no, they
down?
didn't have
Yeah.
bathrooms. They had the common bathrooms, and again, those were big things you couldn't really change. And the bathrooms were downstairs. When you walk through the Quincy Market Building, you have the food court up on the upper level, which is about 6 steps up, where
Hmm.
the rotunda is. And then you are down on street level, and then you went about 6 steps down, and that's where the mechanical areas were and where the bathrooms were. So I said to
Hmm.
them, you've got to clear out some of this mechanical, and you've got to dedicate some of the space for kitchens, or you'll never get restaurants interested in the space. So I told them all that, and they liked those ideas, and they incorporated them into what they were doing. They had to go back to the city. And then they said, would you be able to come up with a concept here? And I looked at the 4 spaces and I said, I can, but I like this one space. And it was on the south side of the building.
Hmm.
Remember, the buildings run east west. So the south long side of the building is the sunny side of the building.
Was Cheers already signed to be on the opposite side?
It was happening at the
Okay.
same exact time. I actually looked at that space, but I liked being down the end closer to the water where the hotel was.
Hmm.
So we talked back and forth, and I said, I like the space. I can put a big patio along here. It'll be on the sunny side of the street. And the walkway is also wider on the south side of the building than on the north side of the building.
Right. Yeah.
So
But that meant there's more performers because it was wider on our side.
there were all kinds of surprises that came
Yeah.
along that we learned. And the performers are a double-edged sword. They're great for attracting people, but in the summer they attract so many people they block your entrances, and
Yeah.
effectively for an hour or two, people can't get in or out. And of course, you
Yeah.
make nothing off of that. So, that had a whole set of problems. So we put a deal together, and they said, "What do you want to do in here?" And I said, "We obviously want to do an Italian restaurant." And they said, geez, yeah, well, there's Italian restaurants in the North End. There's 100 Italian restaurants in the
Yeah.
North
If you
End.
come out of the space and you take a left and you walk a block,
You're in
you
the North End.
are you're on the you are
You're on
across from the
Hanover Street
waterfront.
in the beginning of the North End,
Yeah.
and there's 100 restaurants there. And they said, can you come up with something else? And I said, no, you don't have an Italian restaurant here. A lot of seafood restaurants. There was a Mexican restaurant, Zuma, and there was a couple other people, but there wasn't. There were a lot of great bars, but there wasn't an Italian restaurant. And I said,
Mhm.
we want to do an authentic Italian restaurant that caters to the locals. And that was the other thing that went back and forth with the success of Faneuil Hall. It, it originally was built so that there would be local merchants that would cater
Mhm.
to the local greater Boston
And they had
market.
no problem having 15 Irish bars. They didn't say that's
No, no.
one too many Irish bars.
Right.
Yeah.
And so when this was all happening, there was a bit of a debate going back and forth. And I said, no, we want to have a restaurant that caters to the Boston market. And there's a lot of tourist traps down here already. We don't want to be one of those. We want to be the
Mhm.
opposite. In the end, they liked. We did some renderings. I showed them to them. My concept was it was a very long space. It's very linear. The
Mhm.
back wall of the space is a historic granite wall. Couldn't touch it.
Mhm.
And then you had this glass box which had no architecture.
Did the cobblestones come into the restaurant?
No, no, they
Oh, okay.
stopped at a
Okay.
curb, and then you actually stepped up 6 inches on the
You
curb
stepped
with
right.
brick. And that was the
Mhm.
actual level of the entire walkway inside the market building.